You hear a lot in the media that Copenhagen is a deadline for negotiations, but I don't think I've ever seen a proper explanation, analysis of why Copenhagen is a deadline, and it really is one. In terms of the negotiations, it has been selected and was selected in the climate negotiations that took place in the fall of 2005, the 11th Conference of the Parties. This phase of negotiations to develop a successor agreement to the first phase of Kyoto. I'm sticking that in very consciously, the first phase of Kyoto. There's a very clear divide right now in the community of nations, those who think that we can treat the Kyoto Protocol as over, and those who recognize, as Greens do around the world, that the Kyoto Protocol took years to develop, is a workable framework, and what's ending is its first phase. The first phase of reductions and targets under Kyoto was slated to be between 2008 and 2012. So we obviously need a seamless transition as of January 1, 2013, to a new agreement that brings emissions down. But COP11 didn't come out of nowhere, out of thin air, the 11th Conference of the Parties. You want to go back to understand the context. You go back, actually, I'll take you back to 1988. That was the first global scientific conference on climate change, and I was one of the organizers because I worked in government at that point. It was in the last week of June in 1988. It was sponsored by the Government of Canada because there was a time when Canada was in the lead. It was sponsored by the Government of Canada, believe it or not, when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister and Canada was in the lead. It was sponsored at a time that the world community of scientists had been meeting in smaller groups and seminars and advising. President Jimmy Carter was one of the first to get advice from the National Academy of Sciences in the United States that the climate crisis was coming and that action was needed. And at that conference in June 1988 in Toronto, where scientists from all around the world gathered and the events were public and comprehensive, they issued a consensus statement, the opening sentence of which has never been equaled or improved for clarity to describe the nature of the problem. The science over 20 years ago said this, quote, "Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war." That mobilized some folks, and the United Nations General Assembly said, right, we are going to have to mobilize resources. This came on the heels of the Brundtland Commission report in '87, that we must have a global agreement that sets out the challenges to ensure that we have a planet to live on. And those treaties had a negotiating deadline of June 1992. Because it was critical that we have these agreements in place. So the Rio Earth Summit took place. I have to tell you an open secret for those of us who were there. You have people now in hindsight, they always look back and say, oh, in those days of 1992, you could have big treaties, you could make big pronouncements, you could have global environmental successes. So let me share now what I said then. Rio was not a success. We fell far short of what needed to be done. But we celebrated it as a modest first step. But it did result in a legally binding international treaty on climate change, as well as one on biodiversity. And the Framework Convention on Climate Change sets out all the science you need to know. It says we are changing the chemistry of the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. Humanity is responsible for a change in the global climate, which could be dangerous, very dangerous, and we must reduce emissions. But we didn't have targets or timelines. Those targets and timelines came in because once this treaty was negotiated, it then draws breath of life. It doesn't sit on a shelf. And once a country both signs and ratifies it, the countries are called parties. Sorry to get into arcane UN definitions, but that's why these meetings are called COPs. It's the Conference of the Parties of the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change that sets out all the basic facts and demands action. 1997 was the third Conference of the Parties in Kyoto, Japan. First time set out targets and timelines. Now, was this brand new? Had we never met internationally to deal with an environmental issue? No, we had, and we'd been successful. We'd just been successful in 1987 with the negotiation of a treaty in Canada, in Montreal, to protect the ozone layer. And we thought we'd learned some things about the characteristics of a global treaty that would work on an issue like ozone depletion, which threatens survival of life on Earth. Basic science, we know that without an ozone layer, we'd all fry, you couldn't grow any plants. Believe it or not, even with that knowledge, some of the industry people tried to fight us. And the Secretary of the Interior from the Reagan administration, Don Hodel, said we don't need to ban CFCs, we just need sunscreen, broad brim hats, and sunglasses. How many of you remember that? It's not as if this is the first time we fought vested special interests that denied the science and made fun of an issue. George Bush ran against Al Gore in the year 2000, making fun of him as ozone man. But we got a legally binding treaty, and the way it worked was rich countries go first, because we caused the problem. Developing countries take on different kinds of targets, and we will be informed by the science and boost those targets as needed. So the Kyoto Protocol was based on the Montreal Protocol, with basic concepts of equity, clear action to be driven by science. But industry had learned a lot